Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. For this episode, I spoke to Dr. Joe Saunders from the University of Durham. Dr. Saunders has research interests in Kantian ethics and media ethics, among other things, but recently he's found himself looking at the way many of us act on social media and not always being encouraged by what he sees. That's why he's been spending some time recently on a question that I think probably troubles a lot of us, certainly troubles me. How should we behave online? So, welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Thanks, Jim.
And the topic we're going to be talking about today is social media and being better online. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, so I wondered if you could start us off by just giving me a view of kind of what the problem is here. So why might some people think that social media as people, or the use of social media as people currently go about it, might be presenting some problems?
I mean, have you been online? Have you ventured online before? I don't know. It just feels like things are pretty grim online. I mean, I remember when social media came about, it all felt quite hopeful, right? It felt like kind of fun, it was exciting. Oh, you could connect with people. I mean, this was their kind of marketing. And then there were some suggestions that this might be a force for good or a force for change. And, it's not all been bad. Social media's had some positive impact and has made some change in the world. But as someone who does spend a decent amount of time online, I find a lot of it really toxic. It's not a nice place. People don't engage with each other in good faith. It's often really divisive. I don't know. It's a mess. Social media is a mess. I mean, it's corrupting democracies. It's swaying elections. It's turning people against each other. It's bringing out some of the worst aspects of our characters and personalities online. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the impression I get. But I often wonder kind of how much weight we should put on our own experience of social media. So I'm thinking about I'm a reasonably big Twitter user, actually more of a sort of lurker on Twitter than a poster. But I sort of feel like my corner of Twitter is kind of reasonably okay, but then as soon as you venture out of that, it's a kind of horrific wasteland. But I don't know, how do we know how representative our own experience of social media is, I suppose?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have heard people say similar things and I just think, oh, that must be so nice. When sometimes I'll be like, oh my God, social media. And someone say, oh, I have a lovely time on Twitter. And I'm like, how? And then typically what I find is, I think that either people have a small community of people who they engage with, and they're often either people they know in real life and they're just engaging online, or there's some sort of shared interest or something like that. And so they're able to form a kind of nice online community around it. And that seems positive and good, and I don't want to poo-poo any of that, but it's not the experience I have online. I mean, I do see some of those things, and I'm not saying it's all bad, but I see the way that a lot of political discussion is carried out online in particular can be pretty toxic. Reading reports about how social media feeds into and influences elections and things like that can be pretty bad. Looking at abuse that happens online, and then just reading these kind of accounts of what goes wrong. So, I guess a fairly early stab at this was Ronson's book.
So You've Been Publicly Shamed.
Yeah, and, pointing out just the devastating effects that a bad tweet can have on someone's life. Yeah. I mean, when you read things like that, again, that was a kind of early stab at it, and it's focusing on one particular example of it, but you can kind of see, okay, there's this power that can be wielded online, and we've got to be a bit careful about how we wield it.
Yeah. And philosophers and other writers have done a bit of thinking about kind of how the way discourse happens on social media can lead to sort of specific pitfalls, right? So what are some of those pitfalls?
Yeah, so good. So philosophers are often good with concepts, right? They're good with thinking through phenomena, through various behaviors and kind of tropes and things that happen in the world, and gathering them together under concepts that we might already use, or inventing new concepts to capture them, or taking concepts that we might be already using and trying to tidy them up and clarify what exactly is going on, and maybe drawing distinctions. I mean, usual things philosophers do can be helpful in aiding our understanding. And philosophers have started thinking about social media and what goes wrong. And so there's some interesting work they've done drawing attention to, like you said, kind of various pitfalls or ways we go wrong. So there's quite a bit of work done on virtue signaling or grandstanding, work done on polarization, bubbles, echo chambers, things like that. I could talk more about any one of those.
So, all right, so let's start with virtue signaling or grandstanding. So what's that?
It's the use of moral talk for self-promotion. So I take it that a lot of these complaints about behavior online, and it relates back to Mike when you said, well, is it, how can we know it's that bad? A lot of the complaints kind of focus on the way that moral discussions play out or occur online. So, as far as I understand it, these tech companies have algorithms that are at play to try and maximize our engagement with the platform. So Twitter wants us to be on Twitter basically as much as possible, and does so it can better basically generate ad revenue. I think that's my crude understanding of it. They want us on there as much as possible, and so the algorithms promote and kind of reward in their own like weird impersonal way material that generates the most attention and engagement from us. And it turns out, weird, peculiar social creatures that we are, the thing that maybe generates the most or a lot of attention and engagement is moral outrage. That's something we're drawn towards, right? We kind of like or are compelled by things we find morally outrageous, and it's something that keeps us kind of looking. So let's take that to virtue signaling. So the thought is you see a lot of kind of like moral condemnation of certain behavior online, or a lot of kind of moral calling out of other people. And there's a worry that this type of behavior is almost kind of promoted or encouraged or rewarded by the apps and the algorithms because it generates engagement. But it also brings a certain kind of status or prestige to the person doing it. So I might say, I mean, the type of examples people bring up is I could say like, oh, let's say there's some horrible racist. Let's say Trump says something horrible and racist, right? I think it's entirely natural to be like, oh my God, that's racist, right? Nothing wrong there, nothing we need to worry about in that. Calling it out, oh, that's racist. I think what people who talk about virtue signaling worry about is that people, instead of just saying that, they'll use that moral language to gain status or prestige for themselves. So they would say something like, I care deeply about racism, and I always have, and that's why I find Trump's statement so outrageous. And the thought is, well, you're using moral language, but you're kind of using it to promote your own standing. Yeah. So yeah, you're not just engaging in moral discourse, you're signaling your own virtue or your grandstanding or something like that.
Yeah, and you're doing it to a specific group of people, right? So that's part of the issue here is that you're not just kind of advertising your own virtue, but you're kind of signaling that you are part of a community of like-minded people.
Tossi and Warmke, I probably got the names wrong, but I think it's something in that ballpark. I've got a paper and a book on grandstanding where they draw attention to this and kind of analyze it. And they worry about that. So they draw upon some social psychology that suggests that we kind of seek status for ourselves. That's just a kind of fact about us. And we do it in roughly kind of two ways. One is by like looking good to our in-group, so gaining prestige from our in-group. And another is by looking to dominate kind of potential out-group rivals. And they see this playing out online in the way we virtue signal. So we say, well, I care about this so much. I care about this even more than everyone else does. You're trying to gain prestige from your in-group. Or those people who disagree with us are so bad and beyond the pale, and you're really attacking them. You're dominating the kind of out-group And they think that these are just features of our social psychology that aren't the best bits of us, and that online behavior kind of really taps into and amplifies them.
One thing that I notice quite a lot on Twitter particularly is you'll get people taking an example of the opposing view, which somebody has tweeted, but it's like the worst, like most morally egregious or most obviously transparently stupid version of that view. And then they'll kind of, you know, quote tweet that with some kind of comment, and then everybody kind of piles on. And it seems like that, you know, and you feel yourself going, oh my God, these idiots. But it seems like what's actually being encouraged there is like the opposite of what philosophers call the principle of charity, right? So like as a philosopher, you're taught to kind of find the most plausible version of your opponent's view, and then if you can argue against that, then you've got the kind of most robust version of your own view. Whereas actually it seems like what happens in social media is the opposite of that. You find the worst possible example of the opponent's view, and then that kind of entrenches the idea that that's representative of that opposing tribe.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more. And that, I mean, when I was talking about how this stuff irritates me, that, I mean, it just winds me up, right? and I see it quite a lot. I think so I was thinking about this, and again, none of this is the stuff I'm saying is news in a way. Other people have been cataloguing these various ills, and you even see discussion of it online, but that doesn't mean it stops happening. But I was thinking about that exact point. So sometimes it's called like dunking. Right. So, you know, you find someone who says something stupid and you dunk on them because it's kind of easy, and everyone applauds you for doing it. And I was thinking about it how, so the two of the concepts I mentioned earlier kind of relate to it, right? So the idea that we might be in bubbles or we might be in echo chambers, I think is interestingly related to the way in which the other side's views show up to us. So it's not that we have no engagement or no idea what people who disagree with us are saying, right? It's more insidious than that. We get to see the worst possible representative view of what people on the other side are saying. And then we not only do we see the stupidest, most extreme thing that someone on the other side is saying, we're then even uncharitable to that, and we take it as representative of what everyone else has said. And the other side's doing it with us too, right? Yeah. Because plenty of people who, you know, roughly, whoever you are, there'll be plenty of people who roughly agree with your policies who are saying some stupid, extreme things that you don't agree with. And if people take that as representative of what you think, it's kind of, unfair and irritating.
So that leads to this effect of like creating bubbles. And I think you've got, or you draw on somebody else's work in identifying epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, right? Yeah,
there's this philosopher at the University of Utah, C.T. Nguyen, who does really good work. Got a book on philosophy of games and agency. That's really interesting. But he's also done some stuff recently on various ways we go wrong online. So he, as you were alluding to, he draws this distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. Kind of slightly artificial distinction, doesn't think it tracks a kind of normal use of these terms, the way we employ them every day, which we basically just probably run them together or have a whole bunch of kind of ad hoc ways of distinguishing them. But he thinks there is a difference in two types of ways that we can create kind of like closed off communities online, and he thinks it's helpful to distinguish them. So the first one is what he calls an epistemic bubble. So it's epistemic because it's to do with knowledge, right? So this is a group of people who are usually formed together because they have similar values or interests, or they're friends or something like that. And what he says is like, hey, look, there's nothing wrong with a group of friends. Friends make for great parties, but they make for poor information gathering networks because they have similar interests and similar values, and probably, you know, they have some things in common. So you all get along well, but you won't be receiving the kind of full spectrum of information that's out there. You're likely probably seeing overrepresentation of certain news sources or certain perspectives and things like that. He thinks, in a way, there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's just natural. That's just friends. That's how communities form. And he thinks that these bubbles can be popped. So he thinks, well, yeah, you've got a bubble. It's not a great information gathering network. But if a relevant piece of information comes along that actually draws your attention to kind of a phenomenon that's been overlooked or some perspective that's been overlooked, that should change your views. You know, it might take a while, you might be a bit stubborn, defensive at first, but it should change your views. So that's what a kind of bubble is. It's a group of perhaps like-minded people who maybe get their information from similar sources or have similar perspectives. Not great for information gathering, but can be popped. The phenomenon he worries about a little bit more is what he calls echo chambers. So these are a little bit different. These are a little bit more insidious. So how these work is it's more that there's less to do with the information that's gathered and how much kind of information from different sources or perspective comes in. And it's more that people in what he calls an echo chamber have a significant disparity in trust between members of the group and people who aren't members of the group. So you're inclined to really trust the views of people within your group and really distrust the views of people outside it. And what's insidious about that is exposure to outside information or other perspectives or other views doesn't end up popping the bubble because you distrust those people. So whatever they say, you've got a kind of prepackaged response to, or you're just to think, well, you know, that's what you would say because blah, 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 blah. And he says that in his work on this, he basically, in thinking through this phenomenon and kind of how it works online, is really similar to how indoctrination into a cult works. So he says, it's not, when someone's indoctrinated into a cult, it's not just that you tell them not to engage with any outside sources of information. You provide a kind of psychological, through kind of social psychology, a mechanism for distrusting all those outside sources of information so that you don't have to worry about something potentially popping the bubble. The bubble's kind of, you know, unpoppable in a way, yeah.
There's kind of mechanisms built into the way those communities develop that are going to make it resistant to popping. I mean, I guess part of that is just ordinary confirmation bias, right? So it's just that you tend to give more credence to information which backs up your existing views than to information which contradicts it. But then there's also a kind of social element to it as well.
Yeah, good. I think that's right. And I was wondering something similar when I was prattling on about the epistemic bubbles, because I was thinking, it takes us time to change our minds, right? Both individually and socially. It's not like if we all, I was giving the example earlier of environmentalists becoming more favourable to nuclear power. Obviously, that's not the case for more environmentalists, but let's just take that as a kind of example. You might think, for a while, environmental groups are against nuclear power. There's information that actually it could be useful or beneficial or something like that, and people change their mind. Now, it's not that every environmental group will have immediately done that and immediately welcomed nuclear power. It would have, at first, you might have seen the evidence and thought, well, hang on, that can't be right, and it might have taken time and a while to pop the bubble. But I guess what would make it a bubble in Nguyen's characterization is it was able to be popped and it was receptive to outside information. Whereas if you were just going to distrust it and say, well, I distrust kind of, mainstream science or, oh, it was reported by these people, then if it was never going to be able to get through, then maybe that would make it more like an echo chamber. But I suspect there'll be degrees of, both of these phenomena, there'll be degrees of those things always at play. And at their their least harmful, it'll just be, well, it's a bit of confirmation bias, it's a bit of slowness to kind of change. And at their worst, they're going to be kind of cult-like, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not that these are two completely separate phenomena such that you're either in an epistemic bubble or an echo chamber. The chances are, if you're in a kind of community of like-minded people online, you're at least in an epistemic bubble, and to some extent, you're probably, to some extent, in an echo chamber as well.
Yeah, really good. Because I was thinking about this, because I'm not saying I'm someone who easily changes their mind, right? I'm an academic philosopher. Like, we're annoying, right? Compared to the majority of the population, we are annoying, argumentative people who occasionally like defending a view that might have some good objections to it. But if I think about, there are things that, maybe leaving me aside, but, there are things that I will have changed my mind on or whatever, right? Or, there are political parties or figures or groups, again, like the environmentalists, who will change their mind on something because enough evidence gets presented and it's like, oh, actually, that's not as beneficial as I thought it was. Oh, well, let's kind of change our mind on that. And then, there are other groups of people. So I don't know how political you want us to get, but like Liz Truss when she had her resignation speech last year, she didn't really express any regret for the policies she pursued. She seemed to basically say, well, look, this is what leads to growth. Growth is a good thing. We had to make it. It was a difficult decision. And you just think, okay, I get the ideology, right? I get the ideology. Cut taxes, grow the economy, good for everything. People have been telling you that doesn't work. There's lots of evidence that's not going to work and wasn't going to work in the specific situation we were in last year. But none of that seems to have got through. And then that's kind of worrying, right?
Yeah. And then it didn't work. And you're still not, acknowledging that. All right, so if we think that this is a significant problem then, so what can we do about it? So what you're interested in, I think we should probably say, is you're interested in how individuals should behave in social media, right? So that I guess there are going to be solutions to this that are going to talk about how changes that should be made to the algorithm or the platform or whatever. You're not focused on those kinds of solutions. You're interested in what individuals should do and how they should respond to each other.
Yeah, and when you put it that way, it does sound like I'm making a mistake.
Well, there could be room for both.
Yeah.
For both kinds of solution.
Yeah, so I guess one way of coming, it could be like the piece that I'm writing that I'm drawing upon here is a piece on the ethics of social media. And so there I'm thinking about how we might behave better online. But I suppose there's also structural worries with it, and there's the politics of social media too, and whether it requires, whole-scale structural change. Yeah. And it probably does. But there's still a question of how we should go about behaving online and whether we can do better. And maybe you're right, they're both worth addressing. So all these philosophers, they've catalogued various ways in which we behave badly online. I think they've done a good job of it. I think they're right. There are all sorts of pitfalls, ways we can go wrong online. But they're not just doing that, out of morbid curiosity, right? It's not just like, sometimes logging online does feel like this, where you just, let's see what's happening. Let's watch the train crash a little bit. But they're, they want us to be better online. And their hope is, I think, that in pointing out some of the pitfalls, we can become aware of them and we can look to avoid them. So Tossi and Wonky are clear on this. Let's all be honest. We all vain to some degree, and we all enjoy a little bit of social status. And one way we can do that is by using moral language to either show how good we are or demonize someone else. Notice that in yourself. Start seeing it in people around you, and just be careful to avoid it when you do it. And to also, if you see someone else doing it a lot, try not to reward it so much. And that seems like a helpful corrective. So the philosophers are, they're on one hand analysing ways in which we go wrong, and on the other hand, they're also providing us with suggestions about how we might be better. So the first prong of that is thinking about specific pitfalls and how to avoid them. So virtue signaling, be aware of what it is. Notice that other people don't reward it. Be a little bit on guard if you do it yourself. Epistemic bubbles, do occasionally look for information outside your normal sources. And when you see something that's there, maybe it's worth bringing up with your friends and saying, I actually kind of read something that maybe that isn't actually a great idea. Echo chambers are tough because there's something about the mechanism through which they're set up that mere exposure to outside views or information doesn't change things. So if you remember, Nguyen said there that what was really doing the work there was a lack of trust towards people who weren't members of the echo chamber. Yeah. And he thinks in response to that, what we need to do is start to rebuild trust between people who are caught in the grip of one of these and people who are outside it. So, those are all kind of nice recommendations of what to do. There's two other sorts of recommendations. The first is just log off, right? Just like, hey, look, we were all excited about this. We thought it could change things for the better. Turns out it's not going so well. Maybe we just scrap it, right? And to be honest, it's a pretty good case to be made for it. But yeah, no, maybe we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe there are good things about being online. Maybe we can't put the, I was going to say cat back in the bag. What was the expression? We can't put the genie back in the bottle, Pandora back in the box. You know what I mean, right? Like, yeah. it's here. It's not going away.
Can't put the thing back in the other thing.
Yeah, we can't put the thing back in the other thing, exactly. So maybe we're stuck with it and we need to find out a way to just be better. And another thought there is, look, maybe things aren't all so bad online. And, maybe we don't all virtue signal all that much. And yeah.
And some people have said, actually, maybe virtue signaling isn't that bad as well, right? So there is a view that says, that there may be advantages to virtue signaling. It might just be a part of sort of ordinary moral discourse, right?
Yeah, so I think I first encountered the term, this could be wrong, but probably in like the Daily Mail complaining about something I thought they probably shouldn't complain about, right? There's probably Greta Thunberg gives an address at the UN where she says, good Lord, people, we need to sort this out. What are you doing? And she gets accused of virtue signaling. Because what else are they going to say, right? They either say, well, oh yeah, actually she's right and we do need to seriously change things. Or you find some way to kind of discredit her or make us feel annoyed by her or something like that. And, there is something annoying about people being sanctimonious or whatever, and virtue signaling kind of gets at that. So it's most prominently used as a term online by the right, calling out the left in a way that doesn't substantially engage with the moral concerns the left are raising, but basically says, oh, you're just all doing this for vanity. It's like, well, why the hell think that? I don't think Greta Thunberg's in it for herself, right? And, in a way, who cares? She's drawing attention to something that's,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Survival. Yeah, so in a way, kind of, that focus on the motives of the individual could actually just be distracting from the substance of what's been saying as well. Like you say, if what the person is saying has merit, then who cares why they're saying it? It's an ad hominem attack to say, well, it's virtue signalling, and it doesn't really get us very far.
Yeah, philosopher Neil Levy, in a paper, he's written a paper called Why Virtue Signalling is Virtuous. And, it appeals to the fact that, a central part of public moral discourse is signalling a commitment to certain norms, right? That's how we let other people know what matters to us and what we care about and what's important. And there's no need to be deeply cynical about that. Sure, sometimes this kind of self-aggrandizing virtue signaling takes place, but to think it's widespread or it's the main cause of what's going on is kind of cynicism for which there's no evidence.
Or that it's necessarily all harmful.
Yeah.
And I suppose you could say, in a way, the bubbles kind of, at least construed in some ways, might not be harmful as well, or at least might have benefits as well as harms attached to them. So if you do want to kind of create social change, then step one is probably finding people who are like-minded and, forming a community with them, and all this kind of process of signalling your membership of that in-group is going to be quite important to kind of creating that cohesion, right?
I was thinking about this with the suffragettes in the early 20th century. It would feel so wrong-headed to say, oh, it's just a bubble, and look, they're all virtue signaling. It's like, no, right? It's people realizing that something's wrong, getting together with like-minded people to form a group and a community to oppose a structural injustice, and then publicly signaling their dissatisfaction with the way things are. And it would be a deeply cynical and I think, wrong-headed view to think, oh, it's a bubble virtue signaling. It's like, no, it's not. It's important moral change happening, and that's the way it can happen. So all of that to say, I don't think I think we should refrain from being too cynical about attributing self-interested motives to other people. So I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I was reading about something called the naive cynicism cognitive bias. As far as I can understand, it's basically just we tend to be a little bit cynical about other people's motives and to think they're a little bit more self-interested or in it for themselves than they are. A naive cynicism, cognitive bias. And I think we should be really careful when we do that towards people's seemingly moral behavior, right? Yeah. We don't want to be imagine, can you think of anything worse than being, again, alive at the time of the suffragettes? I mean, bubble, virtue signaling. You'd be, afterwards, you'd be, oh, God, how wrong was I? Counterproductive. That's the worst kind of bystander to be. Someone who's just a lazy cynic from the outside that didn't help bring about change. We don't want to fall prey to that, yeah.
There are some serious problems here with the way people approach social media, and it seems like people are kind of falling into these pitfalls sometimes, and like it's fairly undeniable that there is a certain amount of kind of toxicity in the way people interact with each other. On the other hand, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there might be some kind of advantages to, elements of some of these phenomena that we would want to preserve. So how can we kind of navigate a way forward where we keep the good stuff and get rid of the bad stuff? And what about civility? So civility is something that's often kind of suggested as a way to improve things online, right?
Reading through the kind of various literature that's been written by the philosophers on this, and it all seems to roughly converge, at least that's my impression. And basically what it converges on is just, hey, be nicer, right? Like, be kinder, be more understanding, as you were kind of gesturing earlier, be a bit more charitable, be a bit more patient. And it's all just the usual stuff, right? This is not news. You don't need philosophers to come along and tell you, hey, be a bit more patient and kinder. Your grandparents could hopefully tell you that, right? These are just familiar ways to be better. We're failing online, and we should be better in familiar ways. Now, this all often gets lumped together under the umbrella of civility. So I think the core, it's like we should be more civil online. And what that amounts to is, again, being a little bit more patient, being a little bit more understanding, be a bit kinder, kind of listen to people a little bit more, and so on and so forth. So the literature converges on this, and you see calls for civility online and in writings about it. And basically, I think there's obviously something to be said for this. We can behave badly online. We should be nicer. Civility is an umbrella term for capturing that. I'm okay with it. But I think there's a serious challenge to this, right? And the challenge is kind of where I'm stuck and struggling, if I'm honest. So the challenge is, it's kind of like, really? Like, really? The world's almost on fire. Far right's mobilizing. There's serious threats to democracy all over the world. Poverty's on the increase. It's a pretty bleak time, and in the midst of all that, philosophers are coming along and telling us to be a bit nicer and make sure that discourse is a bit more civil. I had one of my oldest friend quit political philosophy to become a Marxist activist, and when I talked through this stuff with him, he's like, man, go back to like any time in history where serious progressive change happened, right? When there was serious progressive change, when someone, managed to kick out colonizers, whatever. He's like, do you think that in the period leading up to that, discourse was wonderful and civil, or do you think there was started to be a bit of a breakdown of civil norms? Well, why? Well, because people were seriously fighting to change things. And I think his thought is, look, we need serious change, right? We need to resist power. We need to alleviate poverty, find a way to mitigate the climate crisis, and uphold democracy. Those should be our focuses. Those should be our focus, not being a little bit nicer to each other online. So it's kind of a Marxist challenge in a way, right? And the challenge is being polite and civil. They're kind of bourgeois values, right? And they're values that they placate people. They they blunt resistance to power. They stop dissent. And so philosophers are, at best, a bit misguided, and at worst, stopping serious change that we need to occur by focusing on civility.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it feels like it kind of comes down to whether he's right to say that where serious change has been created, it's been without civility, or it's been somehow using kind of modes of interaction that aren't civil. Is that really right? I mean, if you think about like the civil rights struggle in America, or Martin Luther King and Gandhi, the usual examples, were they being uncivil?
So it's funny. asked him these examples, and people usually, the usual line is like, Martin Luther King doesn't make progress without Malcolm X type of thing, right? That, okay, you've got a movement, and you might have some kind of civil voices in the movement, but you also need other voices or actors who are ready to, drop civility and push for real change in less civil ways or something like that. And again, but if I'm honest, I'm just, I'm not, well, I am a historian, that's embarrassing. I'm not a real historian, I'm a historian of philosophy. We don't know anything about how the world works, right? We just read some old dead people. So I'm not a historian. I don't know. So there's a kind of empirical question of like, what's been the best way to bring about change? Has it been through civil means or not? And I take it that the Marxist line is that like change occurs when there's serious material conflicts of interest, and it's kind of pushed through those conflicts of interest. Change doesn't occur through people politely talking with each other about what should be done, right?
Yeah, I suppose that's probably true. Maybe does this in a way come down to kind of whether what you're looking for is revolution or reform? Because maybe reform, the kinds of changes that reformists might be looking for, might be brought about by persuasion and sort of softer tactics. Whereas if you think that nothing short of a revolution is going to create effective change, then civility seems misguided.
Yeah, nice point. Yeah, I did wonder that. I wondered that in a conversation with him, but then I wonder if I don't even know if at times reform feels impossible as well, doesn't it? Like I'm a philosopher, I'm an academic, I'm not a revolutionary, but even reform on these issues, thinking about reforming democracy so it was safeguarded against think what Trump's doing in the States, right? How the hell do you reform democracy against that? It feels really out of reach. Okay, we want to meet some of the climate goals we've set. People have been seriously trying and nothing's happening. So if I'm honest, I don't know how we go about achieving the change we need, whether that change is just some serious reform or a revolution. And I think it's an open question whether civil or uncivil means are the best way to go. There's a philosopher, Amy Olberding, who's got a really great book about the wrong of rudeness. And she's got a few really good articles online. I thoroughly recommend them. And in it, she basically talks just about the wrong of being rude and the virtue of being polite or nice. And I think she's also leaving it open as a question about which of these ways to go is the most effective. But she has a few thoughts that are interesting. So one is she thinks, look, in a society that overvalues getting along and not making waves and being nice and never causing a fuss, then we might need some kind of righteous indignation and rudeness. But she's just like, that doesn't feel like the society we live in. And especially online. If you're online, it's not something where everyone's constantly nice and understanding each other and working out, where you think, guys, come on, we need to cut through this and, call a spade a spade. It's, people are, over the top with a moral outrage in the first place. So she worries that in our culture, kind of incivility's lost its bite. Yeah. She also worries that if we encourage or let loose incivility, as she calls it, that the people who will bear the brunt of this will not be the kind of people at the top, the oil executives, billionaires. They're going to be poor people and people without social status. So, if we're allowed to be rude, or we allow ourselves these moments of being rude, people are going to likely do it against people they can get away with being rude to. And unfortunately, that'll be people who lack power, social status, and things like that. So there are these worries about whether incivility will be effective. But she also just has a nice line of look, bringing about change is hard. Struggling in an unjust world without hope's hard. And maybe we should try and retain our sense of humanity while we do that. And maybe one way to do that is to try and curb in each of us ourselves our worst tendencies and instincts. And being a bit kinder, being a bit more understanding, being a bit more empathetic is a way to do that. I worry that she worries it too. It's that bringing a stick to a gunfight, And then my thought on that is like, well, I don't want to go to a gunfight. And then I think, well, maybe there is a real serious battle taking place, right? Like philosopher Tom Wyman has a piece where he's just straight to the point in a kind of Marxist way of like, oil executives are actively, they're either active or they're complicit in the destruction of the planet for us and future generations. Like, you can face up to that or not. And if you face up to that, then there's a real serious material conflict of interest going on. It's very much materially in their interest, in some odd limited sense, to keep destroying the planet. It's not in ours. And we need to draw attention to that real conflict and have it. And he worries that calls for civility, well, we should chat to them and hear what their views are and where they're coming from and what their thoughts are just completely beside the point. That's not the way to seriously engage. He thinks there's a kind of shallowness to those levels of engaging where we're not really paying attention to the real forces and the real material conflict of interests that is driving society in the wrong way.
Yeah, I can see that. And other examples might be people who are actual fascists online, right? It doesn't seem like being civil towards those kinds of people is really what we ought to be doing. But then there are a lot of people who are kind of short of that, but still might be sort of on the other side of various debates from us. And maybe it comes down to kind of, we have to work out sort of who deserves civility and who doesn't.
Yeah, good. On the walk here, I struggle with this term civility. So, like, it's not a term I'd normally use. It's not a term that, like, I don't use it in my day-to-day life. I know what the word means. I kind of, but like, it's not a term that would come naturally to me. I'd never say to someone, "Oh, that's how uncivil" or whatever. But I see it's the umbrella under which this discussion takes place online. So I've been struggling to think, okay, is it just that I'm like, well, okay, that's the term people use. It's not a term I use, but fair enough. Or if there's something about it that misses something. And a part of me worries that the emphasis on civility does naturally invite this kind of challenge, that it placates people and blunts resistance to power, because civility to me connotes like getting on, not making waves, being kind of respectful. And I think actually maybe that's not what I deeply care about. Maybe what I care about is maybe better captured by something like being humane. Mm-hmm. So it's like, that's what matters. We should be humane. And then there's a question of, okay, so the fascists, should we be civil to them? Well, like, I don't see much point in that. I mean, okay, I can see some point in it. But maybe there's something to be said for being humane for them. And this goes back to Nguyen's point about how to get people out of an echo chamber. And I think his thought is, if you remember, it was like, you need to find a way to reestablish trust between people outside the echo chamber and people within it. And one way you can do that is by being like humane to people, like being kind of open and kind and generous, and maybe you find a way to bring them back from the pale. So he gives this example of Derek Black, who was a Nazi, right? He was a full-on neo-Nazi. If anyone's beyond the pale, it's the Nazis. And how he came to kind of realize the error of his ways because a Jewish undergraduate student, when he was at university, was kind of unfailingly open and kind and generous to him. And he came to kind of trust him, and it transformed his views. And okay, there is some civility there, but there's also some sort of shared humanity that comes through. And again, now I just worry that I'm bringing this is bringing a stick to a knife fight. And I feel like I remain in the realms of like well-meaning hopes rather than any possibility or plan for bringing about actual change.
Well, we're not going to answer all these problems, but hopefully it's given people some food for thought. So, Joe Saunders, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I enjoyed that.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.